Cool, thanks, Annie. Well, welcome everyone to the first virtual field trip of this Fire Ecology and Management Congress. This is pretty exciting, and we think that even when we get back to some form of normalcy with conferences and meetings, that this format of a virtual field trip will be around because it'll allow us to go further than our hours out of an actual physical location for the meeting. So what we'll do is there'll be, we'll first have Kevin McIntyre at the Jones Center at Ichauway up first with a video presentation. We will hold all questions until the video is done, but you can put your questions into the chat box. No, don't put them in the Whova app. We're just going to concentrate all the questions here. And then once the video is done, I'll go through them and we'll engage with Kevin and some other folks that are here to help field questions. So definitely, as you watch and get inspired, put your questions in the chat box. And with that, I guess, hey, I'm Zachary Prusak. I'm with the Tall Timbers Research Station, a wildland fire training specialist. Been doing fire for 33 years and now transitioning into teaching and training pretty much full time in whatever outreach I can do. So with that, Kevin, I will, you're up and introduce yourself and sort of do a little background on what people will see when they watch the video.
Sure, Zach, thank you. Welcome to Ichauway. My name's Kevin McIntyre. I coordinate the education and outreach programs here at the Jones Center. We're very happy to be a part of the virtual field tours for the AFE Congress. We had originally had some preliminary discussions about having folks here live, and unfortunately that did not work out because of the COVID situation. So we're pleased to be a part of the virtual field tours. Unfortunately, this is not the only group that we have been unable to host here on site. So we did a series of videos over the summer that will hopefully give you a good flavor for Ichauway and some of our work here at the Jones Center. A little bit of background: Ichauway is almost 29,000 acres. We've got about 18,000 acres of second growth longleaf pine that ranges in age from 100 to 120 years. We've got about 4,000 acres of young longleaf plantings too. One important aspect of this is about 11,000 acres of our second growth longleaf pine is native ground cover, dominated by wiregrass, a perennial bunch grass that is, for those of you who know fire in the Southeast, is a very important part of our fuel bed. Prescribed fire is our primary management tool here at Ichauway. We've got the site divided into about 140-50 burn units that range in size from 100 to 150 acres. Some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. We're on a 2-year fire return interval, or we try to be. Importantly, we've got an oral history of fire as a management tool that goes back almost 100 years. We know that when Robert Woodruff, who was the owner of the property through most of the 20th century, we know that his management staff used fire from the mid-1920s on. And we have reason to believe from some work that Mike Stambaugh has done here that probably this site has never not had fire as a regular disturbance here. So a lot of really neat things going on here. Of course, many of you are probably familiar with how important the longleaf pine ecosystem is for rare and threatened endangered wildlife species, and it is just a very unique ecosystem here in the Southeast. We are burning about 35 to 40% of our land base during the growing season. The rest of our burning takes place during the dormant season, and that changes through time. So every acre, most every acre here, sees some variation in season too. We'll talk more about this as we get into the videos. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Keir Klepczyk, who is the director of the Jones Center. He's going to say a few words about sort of the bigger picture of what we do here at the Jones Center, and then we will launch into the video. So thank you again for joining us today, and hope you enjoy your time with us.
Everybody, thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. I am the director here at the Jones Center. Been here about 5 years now. Also a research entomologist when I'm not directing things. Just a brief overview of the Jones Center. Kevin covered kind of the land aspects. From the standpoint of the center, we are funded by a private foundation, the Robert W. Woodruff Foundation, the former CEO of Coca-Cola. So our budget comes from that foundation. We're a nonprofit research center. We are focused on the ecology, management, and biology of longleaf pine ecosystems here in the southern United States. We typically have about 30 to 35 graduate students that work with us during the course of the year. This next year, coming up into 2022, we'll have 38 graduate students working with various universities that will do their field work and lab work here. We have currently 7 scientists ranging from wildlife biologists to hydrologists to entomologists to silviculturists and ecologists. 7 labs there that graduate students come through and technical support for that. Overall, we've got about 88 permanent full-time employees. By the time you add seasonal technicians and students into the mix, we're well up over 120, 130 people during the heat of summer down here in Southwest Georgia. As a privately funded research center, we really our base budget is covered to the point where we can really explore the research problems that we find the most compelling and most necessary to address issues of longleaf pine and frequent fire forests. We also, of course, pursue external funding, which goes towards related topics. But it also gives us the chance to really work on this incredible 30,000 acre property without having to travel long distances. There's a lot of research that goes on at this place at any given time. I'll also introduce the people that are on this call for answering questions after the videos. Laura Smith is our herpetologist that runs our herpetology lab. Lisa Genke is a research associate in our plant science lab, and Jeff Cannon, who is a landscape ecologist. All of those will be available to answer questions at the end of the videos. I'll reiterate the direction to put questions in the chat box as we go along so we can answer them at the end. And here's what you're going to see today. As Kevin mentioned, we put together these videos as a part of a virtual event week that we had in October to really showcase the center and the science that we do. And we're happy to share those with you today to give a sense of our property and the kinds of things that we work on. So we'll have a video on the management at Ichauway, on our hurricane research, on the diversity of plants that we have in this ecosystem, on reptile and amphibian conservation, on entomology and forest health issues, on predators and prey relations, and then on restoration of longleaf pine. So welcome to Ichauway. We wish you could have you here in person, but please enjoy these videos, and we look forward to talking to you at the end of that. And now whoever has the magic video starting button, go ahead and press that. We're good to go. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kevin McIntyre with the Jones Center at Ichauway, and we are in one of my favorite places on the property. This is called the Turkey Woods. And one of the most important conservation values of Ichauway is the extensive second growth longleaf pine woodlands that we have here, and much of which has native ground cover like you see here, dominated by wiregrass. What you see here today is really rare on the landscape, and that's one of the important things about longleaf pine. We've got about 18,000 acres of mature second growth longleaf pine here on Ichauway. About 11,000 acres of that is the native ground cover. We've also planted about 3,000 acres of longleaf pine, primarily on former agricultural fields, but also on some cutover sites. And our goal for that is to develop it through time and have it look pretty much like what you're seeing here. One of the things we really like about this site is it's very representative of what we think longleaf pine looked like in its natural state. Longleaf has a fascinating natural history. It's our longest lived southern pine. It can live to be over 400 years of age. It's also extremely fire tolerant, which helps explain its historical dominance of the landscape. Other species of southern pine just aren't as fire tolerant, so longleaf had an advantage there. Natural longleaf forests consist of multiple age classes which develop over time. Two of the mechanisms that drive this are recruitment and mortality. What we find is that longleaf pine produces bumper crops of seeds every 10 years or so. And if those seeds fall in areas of heavy canopy cover, they only live a year or two. If they fall under moderate canopy cover, they'll go ahead and begin developing but stay in what we call the grass stage. And what they're doing there is putting most of their energy into root development, waiting for an opening in the canopy. The mortality side of that, our research has shown that we're losing about 2 to 3 trees per acre every 10 years or so through lightning strikes or small wind bursts. And what that does is gradually open up the canopy in certain locations over time. And so that's why you'll see these patches of saplings in canopy gaps. I mentioned earlier about the importance of fire to longleaf pine, and today prescribed fire is the management tool that we have to emulate that natural process. Because we fragmented the landscape so much through different land uses such as agriculture, urban development, roads, highways, the lightning strike that may have historically started a fire that burned hundreds of square miles until it reached something that contained it like a river or a swamp are no longer able to burn that scale of acreage.
All right, guys, we're going to be burning burn block 66 today. It's about 100 acres. We got the RCW. Here at Ichauway, we usually burn between 12 and 14,000 acres a year.
Ichauway is a very unique example of a working landscape. It's a great forest. It has a history of fire management that goes back at least a century.
Today we're burning about 113 acres here in the Turkey Woods. First thing we do is when we get there in the morning, we look at the weather, see if it's a legal burn day. And then there's typically 4 of us that's on the burn team. And we'll have burn bikes and usually have a tractor and a harrow just in case we need to freshen up fire breaks. We come out, we set a test fire, make sure that the winds are what they say they're going to be. According on what that block needs is kind of how we go about the firing pattern.
It's the most important land management activity. We have to take it very serious. The staff here are highly skilled, we're well trained, and there's a lot of planning and care that goes into it. The average burn size per unit is probably around 100 acres across the board, and it usually takes about 50 or 60 burn days to accomplish all the acres that we want to burn on an annual basis.
We burn in between 12 and 14,000 acres, and then you're a limited time of when you can do that, and we know how many acres we want to burn, but what we don't know is starting in January how many good burn days we're going to have. So we have to take advantage of each and every good burn day so that we can get our acreage in.
Most people view fire in a forest as a devastating, destructive force, but in reality, fire can be a good and necessary tool. One of the things I like to say is fire is neither inherently good or bad. It's an agent of change.
Here on Ichauway, we've been restoring the red-cockaded woodpecker population for over 20 years. Historically, there would have been a very large red-cockaded woodpecker population here, and that population declined to one individual bird in the late 90s. We've used a couple specific techniques to improve their population. We've put in artificial cavities that they use regularly, and then we've translocated or moved red-cockaded woodpeckers from other properties to here. And so over time, we've been able to increase the population exponentially. We have about 125 individuals that are on Ichauway now. We have 43 breeding groups as of this breeding season, and 45 active clusters, with an active cluster being a location where you have at least one red-cockaded woodpecker. As far as their importance across their range, they've really driven a lot of management. They are dependent on large mature trees in this pine savanna habitat that's maintained by prescribed fire. And so there are a lot of large publicly owned properties that have a mandate to manage for red cockaded woodpeckers. And fortunately, that management provides a lot of benefits for other species that are tied to this system, like gopher tortoises or indigo snakes and a lot of other bird species. So they've been very important regionally as far as conservation and restoration.
Our forest management system is based on the Stoddard-Neal system, which is really a form of single tree selection developed by Herbert Stoddard and Leon Neal on quail shooting plantations in South Georgia and North Florida. By single tree selection, what we mean is that we are going through the woods and choosing trees to take out, usually in an effort to improve the quality of the stand by removing defective trees. Things that we're looking for are basal fire scars, crown health, crown ratio, crown shape. The coloration of needles can tell you a lot about how healthy the trees are. And basically trying to distribute that evenly across the forest and really replicate those patterns of recruitment of younger age classes into the forest and imitating, if you will, the natural mortality of trees from lightning and wind throw by our harvests.
This is an area where we recently completed an operational timber harvest of a natural longleaf pine stand within right at about 250 acres. There were several objectives associated with this harvest, one of them being forest health, some others being wildlife management, and the encouragement of longleaf regeneration and release of longleaf regeneration. One of the things that we look for when we're looking at which trees to remove during a timber harvest, since we practice single tree selection and use a modified Stoddard-Neal approach, we're looking at different things on each tree when we walk through the stand. One example might be a fire scar at the base of the tree. There's a couple reasons that we might select this tree for removal. It's more likely to catch on fire when we're burning, and it could catch on fire and burn down. Also, it can cause smoke issues if it catches on fire and burns for a significant period of time in a smoke-sensitive area. And that's not the only factor we look at when we're deciding whether or not to remove a tree. In this case, we did decide to remove this tree because we have several other mature trees that are dominant trees in the canopy that'll be released when we remove this tree. This tree has a couple reasons that it was selected for harvest. If you look at the crown of the tree, it has a lopsided crown, which basically means all of the limbs in the crown are growing on one side of the tree. It actually has a dead top or dead top of the crown. So its vertical height growth it's not going to increase in vertical height anymore. And it's also a suppressed tree that's being suppressed by some of these larger trees that are dominant trees in the overstory.
The Stoddard-Neal system believed in long time scales and looking forward at long time scales. And again, maintaining perpetual forest cover, never coming in here and clear cutting and starting over again. That just wasn't in their playbook at all. The goal is to emulate these natural patterns of regeneration and mortality, demographics if you will, and maintain forest cover through time and reap benefit as well. I feel like the impact of our work here at the Jones Center goes a long way to making more people appreciate the values of longleaf pine, particularly the wildlife value. This forest structure provides habitat for a suite of wildlife species that you find nowhere else.
I'm Jeff Cannon. I'm a forest landscape ecologist at the Jones Center, and we're out here today looking at some hurricane research. And so about 2 years ago, Hurricane Michael came through this area and downed about 20% of the trees on the property. And so hurricanes can represent a huge loss to foresters. And so we're looking at doing some research to try to mitigate that and try to help them find some strategies for making their forests more resistant to wind. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is looking at longleaf pine. And longleaf pine is a really important and rare species, tends to have higher wind resistance, higher drought resistance, and it can withstand relatively hot fires, which all of these things we're expecting to see more of with climate change. And so one of the things that we're trying to do here is actually quantify and measure how much more wind resistant is longleaf pine. And so we're doing that with some winching experiments. And so we're climbing about 30 feet high in the trees, attaching some rigging and attaching that all to a really giant electric winch. And then we're measuring how much torque it takes to pull down trees of different sizes. And the hope from this research is to compare a lot of different species, a lot of different soil types, so that when foresters are trying to make decisions on how to manage their land, they have some information to base on, which species might be the most wind resistant, how might they do planting, changing densities, or maybe planting hedgerows, like what's the best way to deal with some of the increased risk from wind damage. So the winching tells us a lot about the strength of an individual tree trunk and the roots and how it interacts with the soil, but another huge part of wind risk is the actual crown. So the crown is this giant sail that's on top of the tree, and depending on the architecture, the size of the crown, where it's oriented, how porous it is, can change wind risk a lot. And so one of the things we're doing is using LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR, which gives us really high resolution imagery of crowns, so we can look at their architecture, we can look at their size and volume, and then we can look at things how their position in a forest stand changes the crowns and how that influences wind damage. One of the things that we're hoping to gain from doing this research is try to develop some best practices to help managers better mitigate wind damage. And so it's really difficult to study wind, but we plan on doing some work looking at how wind actually moves through forest. How does tree density change how wind moves through there? How do the crown structure change how wind moves? And then how do those factors kind of stack up to make trees more or less vulnerable? So in the end, what we think we'll be able to say something about is, how the vulnerability of a stand changes over the lifetime of a forest. So a forester can kind of know, so almost from an insurance perspective, how much risk they're taking by letting their trees grow for a longer time. So the Jones Center is a really amazing place to work. It's a 30,000 acre playground for research. And even though it's sort of a remote place, it's really busy with students. I think there's somewhere between like 30 to 40 students right now. And kind of helping students get engaged and start on their projects is one of the most rewarding parts of the job here.
I've been at Ichauway since May 2020, right after the pandemic started. I originally heard about Ichauway when I was doing my undergrad at the University of Florida, studying forestry at the University of Florida. This is kind of the ecosystem that we're accustomed to, so when you come across great management, and you see it here.
The Ichauway landscape occurs on top of karst topography, which is a soft limestone that dissolves in places and marks the landscape with sinkholes and depressions. Geographically isolated wetlands can develop over time in these lower elevation sites. And these wetlands make up only about 2 to 3% of the total land area, but they harbor a disproportionate amount of rare and unique plants and animals in this ecosystem. Every year we bring in about 3 or 4 seasonal technicians into the plant ecology lab, and I find it such an enjoyable ecosystem. So it's fun to be able to share these species and to be able to teach people plant identification, and because it's just not a skill that's taught in a lot of places, and certainly not even at a lot of schools anymore. I have a lot of opportunity to share what I have learned about this ecosystem in my time here. Today we're going to come out to flag flowering individuals, so that we can come back in a couple of weeks or a couple of months when the fruits are ripe and the seeds are ready to collect. The plants that we're looking at today are Harper's St. John's wort, Ond Meadow Beauty, and Boykin's lobelia. So after collecting, we'll bring the seeds back to the lab where we'll ultimately store them in our conservation seed bank. That way they can be useful for future studies looking at genetics of these rare species, or we can propagate them and use them in restoration projects. Since 2019, we've been able to collect seed from 23 species that are considered to be rare in Georgia. We have documented over 1,100 unique plant species on Ichauway, which is almost a third of the diversity of the state of Georgia. So just in our little postage stamp square of Ichauway, we're capturing just an incredible amount of biodiversity. And the coastal plain in general is known as a biodiversity hotspot, and so if you're into plants, it makes it a really incredible and interesting place to work. We're always finding new species. Just last week we added a new species to the Ichauway herbarium, so I think that got us up to 1,113 plant species that we've documented. So we have about 35 species on Ichauway that are ranked by the Georgia DNR as either vulnerable, imperiled, or critically imperiled in Georgia. And nearly half of those occur in some of our wetlands or at the margins of the wetlands. And some of those species include Lobelia boykinii or Boykin's lobelia, which is imperiled, also including things like Ond meadow beauty and Harper's St. John's wort. However, because we have a relatively intact landscape here at Ichauway and we've used prescribed fire over the last century or so, a lot of them remain fairly abundant in our geographically isolated wetlands. What's so inspiring to me about what we do is having the ability to work every day on the incredible Ichauway land base and to work with a diverse array of partners through the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance. Together, we're able to prioritize the most vulnerable species in the state and work together to ensure their long-term survival.
Longleaf pine ecosystems provide important habitat for reptiles in the southeastern U.S. Over 50 species of reptiles are associated with longleaf pine and the embedded seasonal wetlands, with some listed as endangered or threatened, and many almost exclusively dependent on well-managed longleaf pine woodlands. The Herpetology Lab at the Jones Center works to further conservation of these species by studying their life history and ecology, with a focus on questions related to habitat management and restoration. Let's look at a few of these longleaf pine specialists.
The longleaf ecosystem, we believe that it was more of a pine grassland or pine savanna. Fire plays a really important role in maintaining the longleaf pine forests and the structure that you see here. It creates and maintains an open understory with lots of herbaceous vegetation. That's food for gopher tortoises. It's cover for things like snakes. The whole forest structure changes if you don't have fire. It'll just grow up into an oak thicket. You lose the ground cover and you lose the diversity. You don't have that habitat structure that all these different animals need.
We are checking tomahawk live traps to catch tortoises. So we set up the live trap, which just means that there's a pressure plate at the back that the tortoise has depressed and closed this front door right here, trapping him inside. And we check the traps twice a day just because it gets pretty hot. So we'll check them around 9 o'clock in the morning and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then we'll bring them back to the lab and process them and take some measurements of like the tortoise's length, width, weight, and things like that. And then each tortoise gets a specific ID number to indicate that we've caught the tortoise before. Their burrows are also used by over 360 other species, including mammals, reptiles, amphibians, namely the gopher frog uses these burrows a lot.
They're really important, disproportionately important to the habitat.
Yeah, a lot of insect species use the burrows as well.
This is a Florida pine snake. This habitat that you see around us is really ideal for a snake like this. This species really needs that open canopy pine forest. This is a snake that is a longleaf pine specialist, and since longleaf pine is in decline and there's less than 5% of the habitat remaining, that means that the snake is actually in decline as well, along with the habitat. So it's a fairly uncommon snake in a lot of places where it once was common, but it's tied very closely to fire. If you burn this habitat regularly, you're more likely to create the kind of habitat that pine snakes really need. This is our eastern coachwhip. It is one of our native snakes here in the longleaf pine ecosystem. It's one of the largest snakes that we have here in the longleaf pine ecosystem. Our record on Ichauway, I think, was 7 foot 6 inches, so this gets to be a pretty sizable snake. They have really, really large home ranges. They travel pretty large distances, and they're unusual compared to other snake species in that they're active foragers. So most snakes will sit and wait for prey to come by, but coachwhips are different in the fact that they will actively hunt down their prey. So they'll do a periscope action where they'll lift their heads off the ground, and they'll look for prey, and they'll key in on it, and they are fast enough to hunt down even a really, really fast race runner lizard. So I think these guys are pretty remarkable. They're considered open pine specialists, so this is really great habitat that you see here for coach whips. They like this open pine canopy, the grassy understory. It needs to be fairly open because they are foragers and they need to actually visually cue in on their prey. So having this open, recently burned habitat is really great for an eastern coach whip.
So this place where we get to work, and some of us even actually live here, is called the Jones Center at Ichauway. And the way I kind of separate those is, to me, the Jones Center is what we do, and Ichauway is where we do it. It's a special, rare piece of property. It's a piece of longleaf pine ecosystem that you're not going to find really anywhere else. The longleaf pine ecosystem is among the most diverse in the entire world, and a lot of species diversity in terms of the number of plants and mammals and reptiles and amphibians. We know a lot less about the insects that are found in the longleaf pine ecosystem. We've identified maybe 300 species here. There's surely way more than that. In fact, our kind of informal slogan here is there's so many bugs and there's so little time. Part of our work is to determine what are the components of the longleaf pine ecosystem, especially the insects. Anything we do in the entomology lab is going to involve capturing insects and monitoring insect populations in some way. And so an average day for the people in our lab is to head out into the field, check various insect traps that we've got in various plots, many of them corresponding exactly to some graduate student project, bringing them back into the lab, separating out all these sometimes hundreds, even thousands of insects we catch in a trap by group into species that we might be interested in counting in particular, then pinning them on little tiny pins, putting them in drawers, and eventually identifying them down to species wherever we can. So it's a lot of field work followed by a lot of lab work to really narrow it down to exactly what insects we've found.
This is a lingering funnel trap, and to beetles it kind of looks like the silhouette of a tree. So they fly into it and then fall down into this cup here. And yeah, like you can see all sorts of things. Basically we just pour it into this jar. Then we'll bring this back to the lab and process it, sort through it, and identify what we have. We're discovering species that we haven't found here in Ichauway. Without a doubt, there's species unknown to science on this property. We may have them already in jars inside our lab and we just haven't gotten to them yet, but without a doubt, there are insects unknown to science on Ichauway. I also feel really fortunate to work in a place with so many great people. We all get along really well, and there's a lot of passion for ecology and fun times to work hard but still enjoy it.
This is the best part of working here by far. I mean, I'm not only the research entomologist, I'm the director of the center, so I stay busy with a lot of things. And having competent, wonderful, awesome, funny people to run my lab for me is the best part of my job. People like my research associate Tom and my technicians like Jasmine and Gabriel, graduate students that I've got here working from various institutions. They're the ones that really do the work and that really give me the creative energy to think up big ideas and work on the next project. And this is a great place to work. It's a great place to be a part of a team because we don't have a huge scientific faculty here, and so we collaborate a lot. People tend to work together a lot. It's an amazing, incredible ecosystem to work in, and there are just so many research questions out there to be answered. We're a small enough place that everyone gets to work together, everyone has to work together. We get along well, we have a great time, but we're a big enough place that we can really make a difference.
We're at the Green Grove Predator Exclosure. This is about a 110-acre fenced-in area that has an electric wire at the top, middle, and bottom, and it's designed to exclude mesocarnivores. That would be sort of the mid-sized mammalian predators that we have in the region: coyotes, red and gray foxes, bobcats, raccoons, opossums, things like that. When we built these, our interest was primarily in measuring direct impacts. And by direct, predators kill prey. And so when we started this study, our interest was strictly in population level responses of prey species to reduce predation pressure. When we first built these fences, we really didn't think we would see a large response in white-tailed deer. The reason for that is the fences are small, only 110 acres, and we knew that whitetails had home ranges much larger than that. And instead, what we saw almost immediately, white-tailed deer prefer to be inside the fences. And for a period of time, the number of deer inside the exclosures relative to the plots that we use for comparison was probably 5 or 6 times greater. The deer suddenly sense a reduced predator abundance, and so they use it much more than they would if predators were present. I mean, really, it's all aspects of their behavior seem to be affected by the predator. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Fear is a powerful motivator. And so much of our research now deals with trying to quantify the prey response to risk of predation. A lot of people are often surprised when they find out that we spend a lot of time studying rats and mice, small mammals. But these small mammals support the predators. And one of them in particular, which is the hispid cotton rat, if it's not the most common, it's tied for the most common small mammal on the property. That species makes up probably, I think it's safe to say 50% of the diet of most of our predator species here. So they're that important. And so it's important that we know where these animals are, how our management, especially prescribed fire, affects their populations, because they're the species that hold up the predator community.
We are small mammal trapping. We set a bunch of these Sherman live traps out and put some bait in it and left them overnight, and we caught a hispid cotton rat here. And now we're gonna take some biological data from this rat. So this animal does not have any ear tags, which means we've never caught it before. So one of the things we typically do is we will put an ear tag on these animals so that in the future, if we recapture them, we will have that information to know that this is an animal that we've had before. And you can do a lot of data analyses with that kind of MORC recapture data. And she weighs 132 grams. That's actually a pretty good sized rat. So one of the things we take is the hind foot length, which we just measure the longest toe on one of the feet. And her hind foot is about 27 millimeters. I think they just play a really interesting ecological role in this ecosystem. A number of years ago, we did a research project where we put tiny little radio collars on these guys, and we tracked them, and we're interested in what the cause of death was for them. And basically what they do is they sort of like feed everything up the food chain. We found them in 5 different species of snakes. We found them in owl pellets and hawk's nests. We found them in raccoon poop and bobcat poop and coyote poop. And so I find that by studying like cotton rats, you kind of get glimpses of like everything kind of higher up on the food chain as well. All right, rat, here you go.
What we see immediately following prescribed fire is we do not see a lot of fire-related mortality. You know, people think that when you're burning the forest that animals are, running screaming on fire. That's not the way it happens. Normally, these small mammals, most of them are able to escape the fire. Either they find a break in the fire line, or they'll go underground, stump holes in gopher tortoise burrows. But the fire itself really has a very minor impact on mortality, if at all. What happens immediately after that fire, when this area is burned, it's wide open, it's blackened earth. Imagine if you're a small mammal looking for a meal. First of all, the meal is difficult to find, and then secondly, you're exposed. You're exposed to birds of prey, you're exposed to mammalian predators, and so what we see after a fire is the small mammal populations generally decline pretty rapidly, but it's due to predation following the fire. It's not the fire itself. If we didn't burn the forest, it would eventually shade in and the habitat would be unsuitable for the very small mammals that the predators are pursuing. So it's just a cyclic thing and it just continues on.
So longleaf pine acreage bottomed out about 1995 or so at 3.5 million acres, and the story has taken a good turn since that time. We've gone back up to about 4.7 million acres of longleaf pine. There's just been a groundswell of interest and engagement by both private landowners and public agencies. Most of the longleaf pine that's been planted since that time looks something like what you see here. This stand was planted about 7 years ago, so it's coming into its 8th growing season, and we're going to go look at some other stands that are a little bit further along that pathway. So this was burned about 3 to 4 weeks ago. One of the advantages to starting prescribed fire, within a couple years after you plant these stands, is you begin to prune up these lower limbs, and so you get that form that we like in longleaf pine of a straight, clear bole, and you don't have really limby trees. It's really interesting. People, for some reason, this tree grew very slowly. I can't tell you why, but there is something about this tree form that just fascinates people. They call it cousin it, a bottle brush, all sorts of names for it. But it really, and that's actually where we got our logo for the Jones Center at Ichauway. We developed a new logo about 4 or 5 years ago.
So this is another agricultural field that we have planted back into longleaf pine. The first one that we looked at was about 7 years old, and all we had done is planted it and let it grow for 7 years. What you're seeing here has had a first thinning, and what we do is we come in and we take out every 3rd row, and then we choose some trees to take out in the intervening rows. One thing that's really important about this first thinning is it allows enough sunlight to reach the forest floor that these understory plants can survive and thrive. The next thing that we did here is we came in and cleaned up some of the timber litter after the harvest, and we planted native understory plants. Primarily what we're looking to do here is reestablish grasses as a fuel for prescribed fire. Also legumes, things like goat's rue, beggarweed, things like that are great wildlife foods. They also put a lot of atmospheric nitrogen into the soil and enrich the site and help the trees grow. This is our oldest agricultural field that's been planted back into longleaf pine, and this was established in 1987. We thinned this in 2004 for the first time. We took out every 3rd row of the larger pines. Again, like the site we looked at earlier, we came into the takeout rows and planted wiregrass and lopsided Indian grass. We also planted some legumes here. That was very successful. Within a couple of years, these trees started to develop cones. We got our first crop of natural regeneration. You can see it's thriving here. So we're very pleased with that. We actually did a second thinning in 2014. And this was really one of our showcases. And unfortunately, in January 2017, we had a tornado that impacted this site. We were able to clean this up a little bit. And then 18 months later, Hurricane Michael comes along and again did a lot of damage in this stand. We were really pleased with the regeneration and the native ground cover that we had planted, and so we decided not to try to do any salvage in here. So this really represents our sort of furthest step with restoring longleaf pine in these old agricultural fields. I think it's safe to say we would not have thinned it this heavily as what you see now were it up to us, but again, that was the hurricane. But it has really made this second age class of longleaf pine jump, and so we're pleased with that. We've got a little bit more hardwood coming on in here than we would like, and we'll deal with that in the next few years.
But by and large, we're still very proud of this stand. Like I say, it's been beaten up a bit, but this is really starting to look like a natural longleaf pine stand rather than something that we planted in rows.
Well, thank you. That was a great collection of videos. That's amazing. It really drives home the point that a large scale landscape supports a diversity of not only species, but processes, but also researchers. And, you know, Kira, I definitely hear you on the insect number. People ask, hey, how many bugs do you have? It's like, I don't know. And yet, you know, it's the most challenging part actually of trying to find out what's on your site. And you need, and I'm glad you need so many people to pin them and collect them and then, oh yeah, identify them. So we had a question about the 3D modeling and if that came from drones, but I think Willie, I think you said that that was LiDAR. So anyone here from the Jones Center can comment on what those 3D models.
Yeah, I'll take that. I'm Jeff Cannon. I'm a landscape ecologist at the Jones Center and do a lot of work with hurricane disturbance and using LiDAR to look at spatial pattern and processes in longleaf. And that those models you saw were derived from LiDAR. The color was actually false color. It's not from drones. The LiDAR picks up an intensity of a return and leaves absorb a little bit of energy and return a different intensity. So you're kind of able to fake some color to make those things look a little bit more visually interpretable. So that's what you're seeing in some of those color looking models.
Thank you. I have a quick question about the RCW management. Has the delisting issue affected sort of the site's management in general?
I'll take that one, Zach. Not really. We had basically before the downlisting ever came up, we had already reached the point at which we would no longer receive birds. The quick story for those who don't know is we had a natural population that got down to one bird by 1999, and so we have put in nest boxes and moved birds. And we're up to about 50 active clusters now. We estimate about 140 birds or so. So really that has not, the downlisting itself has not, or the proposed downlisting has not really impacted us. The birds took a little hit with Hurricane Michael. We got, like everybody else, got back out there and quickly replaced the cavity boxes that we had lost. And so everybody's happy again. And again, the population is thriving.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks, Kevin. And so another question, and this is something that all land managers have to grapple with, and the challenge can be sometimes overwhelming, but how do you all address your management in preparation for the climate change effects, you know, short-term, long-term?
I saw Jeff. Jeff, did you want to take that, or I can jump in?
Yeah, why don't you jump in? I could maybe talk about some research going on to address that.
Yeah, I mean, it really, that step one for us is to manage this species and this ecosystem in the best way we can to keep it healthy and resilient. I know resilient is that is almost lost its meaning. It's been overused so much, but healthy, productive, resilient, diverse ecosystems is step one for us. It also helps that our species, I would say species of choice, but the species that we're here and living amongst tends to do a pretty good job at handling drought and higher temperatures. There are physiological and morphological adaptations that give it kind of a leg up in being able to withstand that kind of thing. Beyond that, and this is maybe where Jeff started to say something a little bit, we are a participant in a network of experiments and study sites called Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change, developing our own prescriptions to fit it in with that framework. And Jeff, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that and related issues.
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a second. I was just going to mention the Adaptive Silviculture project that's here, which is part of a national study. And they are essentially, it's led by Linda Nagel, who's at Colorado State University, and different flavors of it are implemented at different forests across the country. And so one of the, so some of the treatments that we looked at were some of the climate impacts that went into the planning for that. A lot of it was primarily focused on, what we can do to continually manage with fire, one, and then second, thinking about drought resistance. And so longleaf pine has higher drought resistance than other pines and some of the hardwood species. So some of the treatments were manipulations of density and that tree composition. What was interesting, though, is that even though the planning was really focused around drought, drought effects, immediately, maybe 2 years or 3 years after implementation, Hurricane Michael came and caused a huge impact, which of course is another expectation of climate change. And so one of the early results that we found from looking at adaptive silviculture is that you can sort of have different outcomes. Planning for one kind of disturbance might push you towards one type of management, and there can be trade-offs. If you're focused on drought versus wind, there might be different management approaches and trade-offs among those. So we have a paper about that. I can't remember the journal off the top of my head, Forestry, I think, that I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested in reading more about it.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, Keir, I'll echo what you just said. That term has been run into the ground a lot. And, even with my previous the folks I used to work for at TNC, that term and trying to get a handle on it, when I think really, you go back to the classics of what has made your site so amazing and other large scale sites is the size. It's the classic, from the island biogeography from Wilson on, the bigger the landscapes, the more you can devote your time and effort into preserving the processes, fire and water that got you there. You'll be best suited for what will happen in the future, because you can't make a model for everything. And so I'm glad to hear you say that. But what you all are doing is just incredible. And I think that's a great model for other sites. Just continue to manage the best that you can and study it. So I guess one question here, how can researchers get involved with the science at the Jones Center?
Well, yeah, and I guess I didn't really mention this much in my overall overview of the place, but so we are not really a biological field station or anything like that. It's not an issue of just kind of calling up our site manager and getting your experiment out on the landscape, because it's a big landscape, but it's not infinite, and because there's so many sensitive species here and so much diversity and other things going on, we really have focused on anything that goes on here goes through our scientists in some sort of cooperative project. So we certainly cooperate with a number of scientists and a number of universities and agencies and so on, but it's always within the context of one of our scientists being significantly and substantially involved in the project. So really the best bet is to, look at our website, give us a call, talk to our individual scientists and see if we've got things in common that we could work on, or grant proposals we could write together, or whatever it might be. We've got some resources here in terms of time and a little bit of funding and a little bit of scientists around and this huge land base. But from the beginning, it was designed not to be kind of open to all. We don't have visitor tours come through like that. It's all involving our scientists. And part of that is a selfish desire on our part to actually be involved and engaged with other scientists, instead of just saying, yeah, you can come out and sample our trees and not say hi. So you'll find willing partners, but it's always in the form of a partnership of some sort.
It makes perfect sense. How have you had to adapt your prescribed fire program to accommodate the hurricane impacts, the reality of sudden fuel loading that's on your sites?
Yeah, Zach, I'll take that one. we estimate that we probably got an extra year's worth of fuel loading overnight in terms of fine fuels. And I'll sort of start chronologically. You know, the first thing you do when a hurricane like that comes through is you start to clear access to your infrastructure, clean up your roads that can get you out to your research sites, et cetera. And so there's just an adrenaline filled energy that drives that. So like everybody does, we shoved trees off the road as fast as we can and cleared roads, you know, as quickly as we could. We found out the next fire season that maybe we should have slowed down a little bit and pushed those trees a little bit further off the road than we did, because what we had were sort of perched fuels ready to just, you know, float away whenever they caught on fire. We took the approach of let's jump in here and burn as much as we can the year after the hurricane, try to get fire through everywhere before the larger fuels were dry enough to really catch fire and create a smoke management problem. We also prioritized burning along public roads from a smoke management perspective. We also prioritize salvage along the public roads, again, with smoke management always in mind. And we've continued to be aggressive. Our goal is to take advantage of every good burn day we have and try to reduce that fuel loading. I think Scott, our natural resource manager, feels like he's finally kind of over the hump on that. We usually burn about 13,000 acres a year. I think he said that in the video. That this year we burned 16,000. And so just really paying attention to getting that fuel somewhere else by whatever means is most appropriate. We salvaged about 13,000 acres and did not salvage for various reasons on the rest of the forested acreage. So yeah, again, just think about your available fuels, getting rid of what you can as quickly as you can so that you can absorb that extra pulse you have that'll come along 2 or 3 years later. Those are just some of the things that we thought about. I don't know if there are any more specific questions.
No, that's perfect. And that is going to be it for our time. Although, Kier, real quick, what's your favorite insect group?
Beetles, as you can see on my wall.
I'm sorry, the correct answer is ants, but hey, nice try. So thank you all very much for the great tour of Ichauway. And I'm sure that if anyone else on this in this virtual tour has any questions, they can contact you all directly.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for giving us some time. Appreciate it.
Oh,
thank you for having us.
Our pleasure.
Thanks everyone for joining.
All right, folks, welcome. If you've been in the sessions, you saw the Ichauway videos and you're going to be here for the second video, great. If you have just joined us, welcome to the virtual tour session. My name is Zachary Prusak, a wildland fire training specialist with Tall Timbers Research Station. Been involved with fire for 33 years. And it is my pleasure to introduce our second virtual field tour and trip of this session. Jenifer Bunty with the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. Huge debate on Appalachian. So this is going to go longer, an hour longer just on that. But with that, Jen, take it away.
Well, I will say in Appalachia, we say Appalachian, or Appalachia, so I think we're right. So as Zach mentioned, I work for CAFMS. We are one of the 15 regional fire science exchanges under the Joint Fire Science Program, part of the Fire Science Exchange Network. And if you're not familiar with what we do, each of the exchanges works to connect fire managers and scientists to be sure that science gets into the hands of managers and gets used on the ground, and that research needs get from the ground to researchers who can address them. We get the privilege to work with a lot of different partners, and this virtual tour was a collaboration like any other. So many people sending photos and maps and showing up in the cold morning to let me interview them. I have some of those partners here who are available to answer questions as well after the video plays. I just want to introduce them really quickly. Jamie Tyson with the USDA Forest Service with Pisgah National Forest, Jenifer Fawcett with the Southern Fire Exchange and the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council and NCSU. Laurel Kays with NCSU and the Southern Fire Exchange. Wes Skeeto with the North Carolina Forest Service. And Thomas Crate and Sharon Bischoff with North Carolina State Parks, who are actually joining us from a wildfire and are hopefully available to answer your questions here at the end. And so first and foremost, I just want to thank everyone who participated and helped create this. And really, this just became this kind of amazing celebration of the work that we've all done together, and a great chance to see each other after, you know, the long separation. And so with that, I'll go ahead and start the video, and I hope y'all enjoy it. Is this one of the ones you were slated to burn this year?
Well, we burned it, yeah. So this is burned twice. So that was the break between the two units.
Fire management in Western North Carolina has some unique challenges. There's a lot of diverse topography, which is the foundation for ecological diversity, different ecozones, as we call them, that occur on relatively small geographic scales. And we have more acres of wildland-urban interface than any other state in the country. Southern Appalachian forests have a strong fire history and a strong history of burning, both from Native Americans and Europeans up to the early 20th century, when, like so many places, we began an era of fire suppression, which threw our entire natural fire regime out of whack. Over the last 20 or so years, we've been working to get more good fire on the ground, whether it's managed wildfire or controlled burning. But restoring our fire-adapted ecosystems is really a story about the partnerships and the networks that have made the work on the ground possible. It's a story about relationships. I traveled up to Lake James State Park, about an hour outside of Asheville, North Carolina, to visit some of these burn sites and hear some of the collaborators who are working to manage this landscape. Can you stand sort of uphill here?
So today we're at the Long Arm Peninsula, where Linville Gorge dumps out into Lake James. And this is an area that we've burned 2 times now, first in 2015 or 2016 and 2021. So 2 fires, 5 years apart. So kind of the goals of the burn were to reduce hazardous fuels. This was a project funded by the U.S. Forest Service on the Community Protection Program.
Peninsula itself, it has a centerline ridge top that fades down to the lake, which was once valleys and river bottoms before the lake was created. It's a man-made lake. And so these ridge tops would have been dry and much more fire adapted and soft frequent fire. And after hundreds of years of humans on the landscape, we really altered that fire regime and even the tree species composition on the landscape. So like Thomas said, we have poplars and red maples on tops of these ridges that are really the mesophytic, wet, cooler trees that should be down in those coves. And so we're trying to shift these drier sites back to what they would have been, and also to make them more resilient for when wildfire moves through this landscape on its own. It's able to withstand the fire and not be so severe and intense that it's destructive to the landscape, but also to our park neighbors and landowners.
And so some of our target species that we're trying to top kill, we've got maple here. We haven't totally killed it, but we've injured it. So this tree, it's a thin bark species. Multiple fires will kill it eventually. Let's see what other species we've got here.
We've got a young hickory here, which again is also like the oaks, more fire resilient, fire adapted. And so this is the younger one. It got a little bit of fire damage, but because it's fire adapted. It just shrugs it off and is sprouting again, and it's going to bounce back.
So it's good for us to have a mixed severity fire effects. We don't want to blast everything out the first time around or the second time around. So we're mixing fire effects, using ground ignitions. We use flares and other methods out here too. So.
And this unit's actually, this whole peninsula is fun. Like you mentioned, the flares, it's actually, we get to get on the boat and shoot flares into the unit from the lake, which is not typical.
we initiate aqua squad.
Right.
So.
It's an aqua squad of one.
No, it's we got aqua squad of 2. So we have 2 boats, multiple igniters on both boats. So we'll use multiple ignition techniques. We'll use flares. We'll actually pull the boat up on shore, do ground ignitions as well. So we'll actually bump around the whole area. And even when we have a helicopter in for aerial ignition, we have to have a backup plan. So we implement the boats and the flares. An interesting fact about this burn was the first time we actually burned this unit, Linville Gorge actually had a wildfire in it. And so, the U.S. Forest Service was managing the wildfire for ecological benefits. And we had a burn window open up. So the community, they're getting all the notifications about a wildfire in the forest. And, so the North Carolina Forest Service State Parks were like, well, we got good burn conditions, and kind of reached out to the U.S. Forest Service. How would you all feel if we did a prescribed fire next to your wildfire? And, going back and forth, the National Forest Service, we like what we're seeing. We think it's a good idea. So we had a wildfire and a prescribed fire going on right next to each other. And, and it was a success story.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the difference that we saw when we were driving into the site about the fire effects, the intensity between aerial ignition and hand ignition or ground ignition?
Yeah, absolutely. And so coming in, you can tell with aerial ignition that we have a more open setting as opposed to where we've done aerial ignition and ground ignitions on the site. Yeah, so it's kind of hard and it's a shock to the system. You crack open the canopy, but what we've got is we've got oaks and then we've got some scattered pines, and these pines are actually the ones we actually want to keep. So we got pitch pine, shortleaf, Table Mountain pine, and then we've got a bunch of dead Virginia pine, white pine in here, which this is our goal. It's hard to see this. You got the standing dead, but this is actually heading in the right direction and where we want it to go.
The other super cool thing that's easy to miss in this is how much you've changed the fuel structure. Like, it looks like there's still a lot of fuel out here, but what you're seeing is big bowls of trees. You're not seeing the same density of small stems, of smaller pieces of wood. So what you've got is large pieces of wood, and then you've got really fine fuels with the herbaceous and the grasses, and those are exactly the kind of things that are going to be receptive to fire, that are going to change the way that you operate in the event of a wildfire. This is.
Yeah, the fires are burning under less extreme conditions now. So, with the closed canopy, you would have to burn under some pretty sketchy conditions. Now we can actually reintroduce fire following up with more moderate conditions because we have that lighter, flashier fuel structure than the heavier, denser fuels.
This theme of controlled burn units and areas that have been affected by wildfire being right next to each other or sometimes being part of the same property is something we see throughout this region. We headed up to another burn unit in the afternoon that crosses the boundary between the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and the Pisgah National Forest to hear a little bit more about how these partners burn together and the effects they're seeing on the ground.
So you're joining us here on the Lake James prescribed burn unit. This is in McDowell County on the Grandfather District. So Lake James is just south of 2,000 acres. It's about 1,950 acres. 200 of those are Wildlife Resource Commission land. It's been implemented, been burned 3 times. The first time was in 2011, and then again in 2015, and then just recently this past spring in 2021.
This is an area on the state-owned game land, state-owned Pisgah section that we harvested in 2010. It's about 40 acres that we cut, specifically selecting for pitch pine and shortleaf pine here. So it's really unique topography. There's some steep ridges and drainages, and also some rolling hills. We're right here on the edge of this Blue Ridge Escarpment, and so we got a lot of. We have table mountain pine, pitch pine, and shortleaf pine within this burn unit across that elevational gradient. Here within this timber cell area, we've mainly selected for pitch pine, and although there are a good bit of shortleaf out here too. And so the objective of this cell was to remove most of the overstory, which consisted primarily of white pine, and was an off-site species. We came in and removed about 75 to 80% of the overstory, selecting for pitch pine and oak and hickory species, and shortleaf pine as well. And so from a wildlife perspective, is really have seen a huge response in the amount of wildlife. We saw a lot of red-headed woodpeckers, which are very uncommon here in the mountains, show up after we started after the timber harvest, and first couple prescribed burns. We've got a lot of early successional bird species that use this area, and from a game perspective, we've seen huge increases in the amount of deer and turkey in this area as well. So it gets hunted a good bit, but we're really proud of this area.
The burn fell under a categorical exclusion that was it was signed for wildlife habitat improvement and/or timber stand improvement whenever it was established. And I think the only caveats to that, it couldn't be treated with herbicides, and not more than a mile of temporary roads to be established within the burn unit. And so that's why it made sense to do a joint burn with Wildlife Resource Commission. There are some pre-established roads in here, but to simply cut it off, at a forest boundary or Wildlife Resource Commission boundary, you would essentially have a straight line over all this topography. And so, just really doesn't make sense from a management perspective. To try and establish new lines, just use those existing roads that go across those jurisdictional boundaries. Table mountain pine, pine oak heath, it likes fire, it wants to burn, and so this has been a great opportunity to get fire back where it needs to be on the landscape. I know when this was being planned out, there was some ecozone math that was done, and it focused on areas that were I guess fire prone already, and then also in close proximity to wildland urban interface. And so on the ridge behind us over here, there are some communities and cabins and whatnot, and so this is adjacent to some private property here right around Lake James.
So there's two real big points that I want to make here. Is we're standing in the southern escarpment. So just as it sounds, this entire escarpment is south facing. Those two ridges have the highest propensity of positive lightning strikes of anywhere in North Carolina. So the reoccurrence of natural ignitions in this area are by far much higher than anywhere else that you're going to see in the southern Appalachians. This particular burn on the Lake James burn has not only greatly improved wildlife habitat. I mean, we've got beautiful ecological recovery here. We've got phenomenal game habitat and bird habitat. But it's also drastically reduced the fuels. So in 2015, we had a natural ignition on Bald Mountain, and having this fire as well as the Dobson Knob fire further up the hill really helped us to be able to open the door of what different management tactics we could take, of really understanding what risk was out there, and knowing where we could drive that fire and where we needed to control the fire, and where we could kind of head the fire into a different direction. So this particular burn is with the Wildlife Resources Commission, has a huge emphasis on habitat, but it also is surrounded by WUI. It's also surrounded by residents, and it's been put to work. It's been demonstrated that these types of prescribed burns can meaningfully reduce the cost and the risk of wildfire.
Along with the government organizations and agencies that
make all this fire management possible. We also have several RC&Ds, Resource Conservation and Development Programs, that are active in this area. I called up a colleague, Jen Haas, with Mountain Valley's RC&D.
Hey, Jen.
To share her perspective on what we're doing to help the local human communities become fire adapted.
We mainly focus on fire adapted communities, you know, getting communities to identify the risk and then take action to mitigate their risk. And we recently kind of developed a cost share program. And so we learned that wildfire education alone is not as effective, but providing an incentive for them to get work done, a 40% reimbursement, and next year it will go up to 50% reimbursement. That kind of helps them get that work done, because a lot of that work, you know, is cleaning out your gutters, which you need to do anyways. It has a lot, and some of the branches touch the roofs. Like, you need to do that for maintenance anyways, but kind of sharing with them the wildfire preparedness spin on it, and other actions they can take to be prepared if a wildfire is nearby. One of the biggest challenges that we run into is convincing people to prepare for wildfire. Fire is a part of the landscape and it's not going away. And so communities have to learn to adapt to live with fire, and we have to be comfortable with fire on the landscape. And so I think it's convincing them and making sure that they're comfortable with fire on the land, and teaching them that fire can be a tool that we can use for land management.
As I was talking with Jen, she used the same words to describe the partnerships that she has with the folks on the National Forest and on the game lands. And that word was seamless. And I work in this area, so I see these partnerships day in and day out. I work to build them. But it was really something interesting that everyone kept using that term, and it made me want to dive more into the story about how these partnerships were built and how they function.
So how did it start?
The partnership has really been driving up in the last couple of years across the board. I think, in my opinion, it's driven a lot by the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. Started out with things like the Fire Learning Network. You've got research being shared, you've got practices being shared. This was kind of captured into the Prescribed Fire Council. You know, when it got formalized, you get a lot more interaction. These are the driving forces, you know, towards a lot of this cooperation that's been really seen in the last 2 to 3 years. Nature Conservancy, getting on board with a lot of burns. And the benefits of prescribed fire for wildlife, silviculture, and hazard reduction burns, they've been known for a long time. So DOD has been taking care of military installations. North Carolina Forest Service has been helping out landowners. Wildlife has been doing game lands. Parks has been coming on here in recent years, doing more burning than they used to. But it's that collaboration and crossing lines that we're starting to see more of. Cross-boundary burns, multi-jurisdiction folks coming over to help other people hit burn windows. It's been really, really good to see. And I think a lot of that's been driven by not only that sharing of information, but kind of that shared footprint. From a funding standpoint, the Stevens Act, you know, within 10-mile buffer of U.S. Forest Service boundary. Some of that money comes downhill from the U.S. Forest Service. I'm on the mitigation staff for the state of North Carolina, and so our job is to manage that money when it comes in, and whether it's the North Carolina Forest Service doing burning, or in recent times Parks is jumping in there doing some CPP burning. I manage that, so when the burn occurs, all the invoicing comes up to me, and I kind of manage the nuts and bolts of it, verifying that everything was done how it should have been, where it should have been, who should have been doing it, kind of documenting all the process that goes on.
I'll just add one of the most exciting things for me of working in fire in Western North Carolina is the fact that we've got all of our state agencies, all of our NGOs working together on nearly every burn that we have. So I can't think of a burn on the Grandfather Ranger District in the 8 years that I've been here where we haven't had either TNC, Wildlife Resources Commission, North Carolina Forest Service out there helping to implement, not just to be able to help their neighboring agencies to meet those wildlife objectives or those fuels mitigation or ecological objectives, but also because that's their jurisdiction. So these burns are being planned across those property lines, and it's good and it's exciting that all of us are coordinated. We're all relying on those same resources. When we do have smoke in the air and when we have either a wildfire or a prescribed fire, everybody gets a call, and you get that call from those residents or constituents that is whoever they're most familiar with talking to. That's who they call. And it's really reassuring that we're all getting the same responses. We're all talking about the same needs to have fuels reduction, to have this ecological benefit, and it's just incredibly valuable for all of us to be talking from the same sheet of music. And everybody's operating under this assumption of rising waters will lift all ships.
Mm-hmm.
So the TNC support that we're hearing of, a lot of that funding came directly from the grandfather CFLR, and so starting up that on-call burn crew that can help out on private lands, that can help out on state lands, that can help out on federal lands, and being able to shift those resources all over the place to wherever the priority is for that day is a huge flexibility.
Yeah, a lot of our burns in Western North Carolina, they take up upwards of 50 plus people, and so it's all hands on deck. We can't do it alone. No agency can really do it by themselves, and so having an on-call crew, state, federal, cooperative partnerships really is how we get it done. One of the neatest things about this area, and a lot happened that wasn't so good, but one of the best things that happened here is this is the birthplace of forestry in the United States, and so I think that's something that we should all be proud of.
Think about that history, about how these partnerships have been built, and also the history of land management in the Southern Appalachians. I couldn't help but think about how in the past, before fire suppression, neighbors burnt this land together. And now we're really just still doing the same thing. We're reinstituting that culture in a new way to manage this fire-adapted landscape the best we can.
That was a really excellent video, Jen. And I was making some comments in the chat box. It just, again, demonstrates this notion of collaboration, getting things done. I always joke that fire doesn't recognize patches, and it doesn't, or boundaries. It's the ecosystems and the lands and the history of fire. And I think Stephen Pine said a quote where fire unites rather than divides. And it's true. It's interesting. The Nature Conservancy has this Living with Fire program, and it harkens back to the idea that on the landscapes you all are in, people did live with fire, and now this idea that we got, you have to work with it. And so I guess, and I don't see any specific questions for the group, but I would like to throw out from the outreach perspective, how many or how do you feel? How do you gauge success in that? Because I know from my own experience over a couple of decades of trying to quote unquote educate the public, outreach seems to be the better term. But how do you all define your successes in that?
So we build capacity when we're communicating with the public the same way we build capacity with putting fire in the ground, or at least we try to. We have our network partnerships. We have lists we keep of media contacts. We direct them to our partners if they're a better answer. I've worked in a lot of different places, and in a lot of different places, it seems like agencies and organizations, not necessarily turf wars, but they don't want to be confused with the other guy. WCS doesn't want to be confused with WWF, and we're kind of okay with it here. At least we've become kind of okay with it because we realize what a strength it is. And because it's just necessary. We got a lot of work to do, and we don't really have the time to, hide behind our boundaries. And it's funny, one of the speakers mentioned, we pulled out the maps at this FLN meeting and Sharpies. And I remember being at an FLN meeting in, my first position in fire in the Southern Apps, and seeing people do this and thinking naively, like, well, that's sort of silly. Why are they wasting the time to do this? Like, don't they know what their neighbor is doing? And they don't, because we have so many capacity issues and so many resource issues with fire. And so to take that time and hand everyone a Sharpie and circle your burn units and see where that collaboration can take place, it's such a basic step that we miss so much, and through so many other parts of the country, it's missing. And it's something that we see time and time again, that, you know, that word seamless, it really becomes seamless. We've had cross state line burns now between North Carolina and South Carolina, and it becomes even more vital when we need our partners to help us fight a wildfire. We already know how each other works. We already know how we communicate, because we're working together during prescribed fire season with the communication, with all these other aspects. So we have that foundation of partnerships and trust and relationships when it really comes down to it.
Yeah, I think, you know, another nod toward prescribed fire councils, toward the private lands, prescribed burn associations, or just simply folks getting together about their own fire issues goes a long way to, like you just said, all right, I've worked with you, and now we have all this in common, and we always have more in common when we talk about what we got to do on the landscape. That's so how about the, you know, you mentioned earlier about the WUI and the urban intermix and interface. One of the hardest things is to try to convince people to be proactive. I mean, we do it in our natural, you know, in our own lives. Hey, you should get a colonoscopy later. But when I have dealt with private landowners who, when they are offered practical ways to firewise, you know, their place and their landscape, don't do it. But then when wildfires happen, they all of a sudden, you know, need help. So what are your experiences in your region of trying to how do you convince homeowners to do what's in their best interest?
Oof. Well, so convincing homeowners is not my personal job. But I can tell you, you know, we do some public information. We've done things like held community meetings when people are concerned about prescribed fire management near their homes. We established the Fire Learning Trail in Linville Gorge. We now have, I think, 6 different segments throughout the Appalachians, which it's an educational trail that consists of signs on the ground. We have a podcast that acts as an audio tour. And that's actually where the term #Goodfire, or that's where the hashtag came from, is we started it with that trail, and now it's sort of taken on a life of its own, and we see it used all over the country. And I think it's sort of, you know, it's hard to avoid fire puns or fire language, but it's a slow burn. You have to, again, build those relationships with your community members. And what I personally do is I listen first. You know, it's just good communication rules. Seek first to understand, find out what they're saying about fire, what their concerns are about fire, if they're concerned about fire, or maybe what they actually do care about. If they care about wildfires and clean, you know, horse riding trails and things like that, then you can sort of get in that way. When I design educational signs, I like to look up, you know, what people visit that area for. Are they coming there for the history? There was one of the signs was featured in that video. And it's the 100 years of forestry and fire safety, because people come to this part of the world to learn about the beginning of forestry. Actually, it's something special about where we live. And I think that's the real thing, especially at least within the Appalachians. You know, we were joking about the language, but, you know, my family's been in the Appalachians for like 400 years, seriously, like in the same valley. And fire is it's part of what makes this place special. People come here to visit because it's special. And so if you sort of tie fire to that special, that message gets across pretty quickly.
Yeah, I like
Can
that.
I chime in with something real quick, Zach?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, I worked for a little bit with one of the RC&Ds in the far western bit of North Carolina. And I think there's also an important class element when we're talking about firewise and home preparedness and that sort of thing. A lot of the Appalachians, at least the parts that I've really been close to, have this kind of bimodal distribution of folks who have second homes and are very well off and often have the attitude of, I'll get the insurance money. And then folks who really just like can't afford to do a lot of the things that are relatively easy but require time and money and, you know, all of that sort of thing. And so I think there are certainly folks in the middle too, but I think that is also an important point when we're talking about reaching out to homeowners in particular, that, you know, there are these sort of two categories of folks that have kind of what Jen was saying, very different interests in what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great point, Laurel. And it's also a great point that, you know, in the Appalachians, especially in the southern portion, there's a big distrust of sort of boots on the ground, people coming to knock on your door. And there's, you know, there's good and recent history and generational memory for why that is. And so it's something to keep in mind and be sensitive about. And I'm sure that each region, wherever folks work, they probably have some things like that too, that you have to consider when you're trying to get these messages across to people.
Oh, for sure. David Godwin does have a quick question about what do you have public support for prescribed fire in Western North Carolina?
That's a great question. I think yes and no. There is actually a portion of the video that I cut out where Nick Larson with the U.S. Forest Service was saying one of the things, you know, he's worked all over the country. One of the things he loves about Western North Carolina is that people seem to get it for the most part. A lot of people remember, you know, their grandpa, their papa, as we might say in the Appalachians, burning his land. And they've grown up with it culturally. At least it's a little more recent in cultural memory than it is at maybe in other places. But we do, and it's not all transplants. We like to pretend it's just like the transplants coming in that don't get it. But there is quite a bit of pushback, and there's a lot of people who don't understand like the basic cycle of succession. They think it's burnt and it's a parking lot and it's just done forever. And so we've been really working hard to get across that idea that succession is a cycle, that you have a disturbance and then it starts with your, you know, primary species and then your secondary, and then eventually it might get up to a forest. But we have a lot of people who think, you know, that we have these really old growth forests in the Southern Blue Ridge, which we don't really, you know, I've had people say, you know, that white pine plantation is an old growth forest. No, it was planted, you know, 30 years ago. It's okay. We're actually going to make it healthier. It's sort of getting to those ideas that it's not just going to burn and be gone for it. We're not going to salt the earth after we do a controlled burn. You know, things will grow again and they'll grow better, and it'll be more of these species like blueberries and these wildflowers that you love, and it supports the game species. And you know, the best thing about communicating about fire is that fire kind of talks for itself. You'll see the difference within a few seasons or a year, a couple of years. You know, they'll come around.
I think I'm going to steal that. Fire talks for itself. That's really good. And I like what you said earlier about queuing in on fires connected to what makes the landscape special and why people are there. And so, like in Florida, we do that all the time. We don't do enough of things like time-lapse photography or taking people, you know, when I was in Brevard County, I would bring members of the public to the site during the fire, after the fire, a week after the fire. And we are all, as a species, we don't like change. And so if you just show people, without even getting into the detail of the species, these beautiful flowers, what you find special, this is how it happened. And so, you know, any matter of really, and I think it's difficult to do that kind of interpretation well, but no, you hit on it. And the connection with the land, we have all kinds of agriculture connections in Florida back to family, same thing, 400 years. We've always burned this, and that influenced the politics of our state. And there's so much that you can draw on from any person's point of view. Why do you, what do you find special? Fire's connected to it. Jamie on the chat said joint and consistent messaging from multiple partners helps as well. Folks appreciate wildlife also and respond well when they know we are creating habitat for the birds and animals they love. There's no doubt I go back to councils, the Fire Learning Network, anything that you can have multiple agency patches say the same thing, that's powerful. And like I said, I used to think we had to educate people, but I just think that it's messaging more than that. And yeah, so that's right on, Jamie.
It is. And featuring those partnerships, sorry to add on, but featuring those partnerships and showing that you're working with, an organization that maybe they trust a little bit more than you, can really strengthen your message. And as a note on the Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network and CAFMs, we have such a strong relationship. We've hired some social science researchers from Clemson to do a study on our efficacy. And one of the things that has come out of those interviews that they've been doing of all of our members and our users is that people say CAFMs in the FLN, like it's one word. It's that idea of it being seamless again, and being part of the Fire Science Exchange Network and hearing from other exchanges in other regions. That kind of tight partnership doesn't exist everywhere. And so it was really, it was my pleasure to be able to feature that a little bit today and to share it with all of you.
You're right. And in like what Thomas mentioned earlier and all the folks in the video about all these different people, no one has the staff or ability to do the work on their own. So by necessity, everyone's working together. One of the benefits of getting older is I remember that wasn't the case in the fire world. People were isolated. And now I'll do a quick promotion for the trainings I've been doing over the past 10 to 15 years. The number of different organizations and agencies, private landowners in these fire trainings has increased. So there's all these different people coming together from the very beginning. And now they're thinking, so your example is, well, of course we do that. Why wouldn't we? And it's a really cool thing that this is how, I don't know, I'm naively optimistic about this stuff, where this kind of collaboration is the future because it has to be. And why wouldn't it be? So that's just really cool. Let's see. So I don't think we have any new questions and we're about wrapping up. So I guess, Jen, anything you want to throw out there as a sort of a wrap up to this?
Well, I'd like to open it up just in case any of my collaborators that are on here, if you want to turn on your mics or your cameras or say something. They're all active in the chat. This is the thing about forestry, folks. You don't study trees for like 10 years because you want to talk to people. This is what I always say. That's why my job exists.
Yeah, I'll say something. So we're on an active fire, as Jen mentioned earlier, and this is a site we had burned multiple times, and we had a start on Saturday night, and because of the collaboration, the pre-planning from the prescribed fire, we basically turned this wildfire into a gigantic prescribed fire, and now things are looking fairly well, and it's a success story because it helped us manage this fire a lot less difficult if we had not planned to burn the whole entire thing. So planning and friends, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, my
That's
supervisor, Helen, likes to call it the fire family. And she often is quoted as saying, we get our best work done over beers and barbecue, because that's when the real connection happens.
It's, for right now, there's no robots doing all this work. It's all people, and we all like to help each other out. And I think fire is a great way. It's this unifying force. And so Jen and everyone with the consortium, thank you so much for this presentation. And it's inspirational. These past two, these two virtual field tours have been awesome. And again, same thing. If anyone has any other questions, Jen, contact you directly, and everyone else in the consortium, Thomas and such.
Yeah, so I should add that all those folks are with their own agencies. I don't know if they would want to be necessarily grouped into the consortium, but yeah, feel free to contact me, or I'm sure any of our partners would be happy to hear from you.
Well, thank you again for the awesome, inspirational tour. And with that, we will close out this session. So thank you everyone for attending. Go see more. And as a quick plug, we have a Mystery Science Theater Thursday night at 5:30 on some fire videos. So definitely attend that. But everyone, thank you so much.